Essence and Appearance, Aspects of Fetishism in Marx's Capital by Norman Geras. Vulgar economy everywhere sticks to appearance in opposition to the law which regulates and explains them. In opposition to Spinoza, it believes that ignorance is a sufficient reason. Vulgar economy feels particularly at home in the estranged outward appearance of economic relations. These relations seem more self-evident the more their internal relationships are concealed from it. The Philistine and vulgar economist's way of looking at things stems from the fact that it is only direct form of manifestation of relations that is reflected in their brain, and not their interconnection. Once for all, I may here state that by classical political economy, I understand that economy, which since the time of William Petty has investigated the real relations of production in bourgeois society, and contradistinction the vulgar economy, which deals with appearance only. It is the great merit of classical economy to have destroyed this false appearance and illusion, this personification of things and conversion of production relations into entities, this religion of everyday life. Nevertheless, even the best spokesman of classical economy remains more or less in the grip of the world of illusions which their criticism had dissolved, as cannot be otherwise from a bourgeois standpoint, and thus they all fall more or less into inconsistencies, half-truths, and unresolved contradictions. This is talking about Ricardo there. In this manner, does Marx on many occasions specify the distance separating vulgar economy from classical political economy, and a fortiori from his own critique of the latter, providing us at the same time with a conception of the minimum necessary conditions to be satisfied by any work aspiring to scientific status, namely, that it uncovers the reality behind the appearance which conceals it. The intention of this article is to deal with a group of problems, in particular the problem of fetishism related to Marx's formulations of this requirement, and to the systematic recurrence of its appropriate terminology, appearance/essence, form over content, illusion over reality, phenomena over hidden substratum, form of manifestation over interconnection, etc. It should, however, be made clear that at the outset, there's scarcely anything is said about the development of Marx's view on these questions, hence about the relation between economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 and Capital, and the relationship between Hegel and Marx, nothing at all. Thus, the process of Marx's intellectual formation and development is set to one side, and these problems are considered only as they emerge in Capital itself, at the interior of what is more or less finished, more or less coherent structure of thought. The theoretical foundations of Capital. If we begin then with what I have called the minimum necessary conditions of Marx's science, this methodological requirement to which he assigns an exceptional importance, the first question which arises is as follows. What is its theoretical foundation? What establishes its necessity? At all events, it is hardly an arbitrary construction on Marx's part. The text of Capital provides us with two kinds of answer. In one, it is revealed that the common requirement of any science, a scientific analysis of competition, is not possible before we have a conception of the inner nature of capital. Just as the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are not intelligible to any but him who is acquainted with their real motions, motions which are not directly perceptible by the senses. That is, in their appearance, things often represent themselves in inverted form. It's pretty well known in every science except political economy. All science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and essence of things directly coincided. In such passages, Marx presents the conceptual distinction between the appearance and reality as a form of scientificity as such, by notifying us that the method he is applying in political economy is simply a general requirement for arriving at valid knowledge, one which he has taken over from other sciences where it has long been established. Taken on its own, this answer is not entirely satisfactory. It makes of Marx's primary methodological injunction to shatter the obviousness of the immediate appearance, an abstract procedure rule which must form part of the equipment of every science, regardless of the content of that science, of the nature of its object of study. Taken on its own, this answer does not yet specify why it is appropriate to extend the methods of astronomy to the subject of matter of political economy. For this reason, we put in parentheses for the moment, though it should be borne in mind since it will be considered at a later stage of the argument. We proceed to Marx's second answer, which is of course a different order altogether from the first. This answer is of course contained in the doctrine of fetishism, for the latter specifies those proportions of Marx's object of study itself, which imperiously demand that appearances be demolished if reality is to be correctly grasped. It analyzes the mechanisms by which capitalist society necessarily appears to its agents as something other than it really is. The notion of fetishism raises quite complex problems, which will be developed presently, but even now it should be clear that we have in the second answer a theoretical foundation for the distinction essence over appearance and its variations, which was lacking in the first. The relation between methodological injunction and object of study is no longer one of externality, as is the case with an abstract rule applicable to any content whatsoever. It is rather what may be termed a relation of adequacy between object and method, the character of the latter being determined by the structure of the former. It is because there exists at the interior of capitalist society a kind of internal rupture between the social relation, which obtains the manner in which they are experienced, that the scientist of the society is confronted with the necessity of constructing reality against appearance. Thus, this necessity can no longer be regarded as an arbitrary importation into Marx's own theoretical equipment, or something he merely extracted from other pre-existing sciences. And the passages quoted at the beginning of this paper are seen to lead by a short route to the heart of the notion of fetishism. It is enough to consult any standard commentary on Marx to see that this notion is not free from ambiguity or confusion, and to some extent this is also true of Marx's own exposition in the first chapter of Capital. It seems necessary, therefore, to adapt an analytical procedure in an attempt to isolate different aspects of the concept and to examine them separately, even if such a procedure runs the risk of fragmenting what Marx conceived to be a unified phenomena. For if it enables us to clarify the aspect, taken separately, the chances of understanding their relation to one another, that is to say, of reconstituting them as whole, are thereby enhanced. An initial distinction, one which is clear enough between two aspects of fetishism, is provided by the text of Capital itself. A definite social relation between men assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. Their own social action takes the form of the action of objects, which rule the producers instead of being ruled by them. In capitalist society, the phenomena of fetishism imposes itself on men, A, as mystification, and B, as domination. Clearly, the two aspects are intimately related, inasmuch as men are in no position to control, rather than submit to, social relations which they do not correctly understand. And that they are so related is reflected in subsequent literature on the subject, where they normally run together. Thus, Geras writes, the relation between men take on the appearance of relations between objects. Things rule the men who have created them. In Sweezy, the real character of the relations among the producers themselves is both distorted and obscured from view. The world of commodities has, so to speak, achieved its independence and subjected the producers to its sway. However, for the reasons stated, I intend as far as possible to maintain the distinction and to treat mystification and domination separately, taking the latter first, although the former is more directly pertinent to the problem of appearance and reality, and also more problematic. No discussion of fetishism can ignore this feature of domination altogether, and it may perhaps be appropriate to clear it out of the way. The role of alienation in capital. What we have to deal with here is not domination in general, but an historically specific form of domination. It differs, for example, from the relations of personal dependence which Marx identifies as characteristic of the European Middle Ages. And this for two reasons. Whereas the domination is undisguised under capitalism, it is concealed. Secondly, and more to the point here, it is precisely an impersonal kind of domination exercised by the totality of economic relations over all the agents of capitalist society, embracing also the capitalist whose overriding interest is the extraction of as much surplus labor as possible from the worker. he too cannot be held responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains. It is unnecessary to rehearse all the aspects of this impersonal domination. The independence of the production process vis-a-vis the producers. The past labor of the worker confronting him as a hostile power in the shape of capital. The instruments of labor employing the worker rather than vice versa. The drudgery and stupidification of the fact, and so on. All these are comprised by the concept of alienation. However, in capital, this is a historical concept of alienation. Its socially and historical premise are precisely economic relations based on the production and exchange of commodities. This is brought out clearly in the following passage. The owner of commodities finds out that the same division of labor that turns them into independent private producers also frees the social process of production and relations of the individual producers to each other within that process from all dependence on the will of those producers, and that the seemingly mutual independence of the individuals is supplemented by a system of general and mutual dependence through or by means of the products. Political economy has never once asked the question why labor is represented by the value of its product in labor time by the magnitude of that value. These formula, which bear it stamped upon them in unmistakable letters that they belong to a state of society in which the process of production has mastery over man, instead of being controlled by him, such formula appear to be bourgeois intellect to be as much a self-evident necessity by nature as productive labor itself. Here, the root of the phenomena grouped under the term alienation are located in specific social relations, and not in the fact that there is an ideal essence of man, his species being, which has been negated or denied, and this is the difference that separates capital from certain passages in the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Even though there too Marx deals with such features of capitalist society as a domination of the worker by his product and the stultifying character of his work, and a place of a concept of alienation founded on an essentialist anthropology, we have one tied to the historical specificity of forms of domination. To this extent, those discussions of fetishism, which simply take for granted the complete unity between the manuscripts and capital, are of dubious value, and conflating as they do two concepts of different theoretical status. And when Lukács, in his discussion of fetishism, speaks of one-sided specialization violating the human essence of man, he is guilty of the same conflation. On the other hand, Althusser has proposed a reading of fetishism in which of the two aspects that have been distinguished, namely mystification and domination, only the former is treated. The notion of men being dominated by their own products has vanished, almost without trace. Such an interpretation demands, of course, that the concept of fetishism be regarded as entirely unrelated to and independent of that of alienation, and the latter is accordingly dismissed as ideological and pre-Marxist. In this reading, Althusser is guilty in the first place of violating the text of Capital. As the following passage makes clear, the character, gestalt, of independence and estrangement, which is the capitalist mode of production as a whole, given to the instruments of labor and to the product as against workmen, is developed by means of machinery into a thorough antagonism. Since before entering on the process, his own labor has already been alienated from himself by the sale of his labor power, has been appropriated by the capitalist and incorporated with capital, it must during the process be realized in a product that does not belong to him. Capital comes more and more to the fore as a social power, whose agent is the capitalist. This social power no longer stands in any possible relation to that which the labor of a single individual can create. It becomes an alienated, independent social power, which stands opposed to society as an object, and as an object that is the capitalist source of power. And even were the term alienation altogether absent, there are enough passages where the concept and all phenomena it embraces are presented to invalidate Althusser's reading of Capital on this point. However, it is not only a question of the validity of the interpretation of Marx, there are serious theoretical consequences as well. For in Althusser, the concept of alienation as that form of domination engendered by capitalist relations of production is replaced, and here is its surviving trace, by the notion of men as mere functionaries of bearers, of the relation of production where determines their place in their function. What Marx regards as a feature specific to capitalist relations of production, Althusser articulates as a general proposition of historical materialism, thus dehistoricizing the concept of alienation in a manner quite strange for a Marxist author. For how is this different from the fault of the classical political economists who regard commodity production as eternal? He makes it impossible to comprehend from his perspective those passages in which Marx anticipates a future social formation where precisely men will control their relation of production rather than be controlled by them, where they will therefore cease to be mere functionaries of the bearers. We shall see later on Althusser commits an exactly parallel error in relation to the other aspects of fetishism, mystification. For the moment, it is sufficient to observe that in his legitimate anxiety to be done with the anthropological concept of alienation, he throws out the historical concept as well, dehistoricizing it in a new way. The reality of value relations. Returning now to the problem of essence over appearance, the mystificatory aspect of fetishism, it will be well to make a secondary distinction between a. The appearances or forms of manifestation in which social relations present themselves and which are not mystificatory or false as such, inasmuch as they do correspond to an objective reality, they become mystified only when regarded as products of nature or of the subjective intention of men. That's very important. That's how dialectical science becomes differentiated from empirical science. And B, those appearances or forms of manifestation, which are quite simply false illusions in the full sense, corresponding to no objective reality. This distinction governs what follows. Unless, therefore, it is made explicit, the term appearance should not be taken to mean mere false appearance. The same goes for the word form, and is helpful one to the extent that it enables us to avoid the kind of confusion into which many accounts of fetishism fall, in which the following passage by Karl Korsch is an example. The valuable relations appearing in the exchange of the products of labor as commodities are essentially not relations between things, but merely an imaginary expression of an underlying relation between human beings who cooperate in their production. Bourgeois society is just that particular form of the social life of man in which the most basic relation established between human beings is the social production of their lives, become known to them only after the event, and even then only in the reversed form of relations between things. By depending on their conscious actions upon such imaginary concepts, the members of modern civilized society are really like the savage by his fetish, controlled by the work of their hand. While there is much here that is unobjectionable, e.g., values relations as the products of social relations, men dominating their own creations, etc., it is incorrect to describe value relations as imaginary. As I shall try to show, Marx does not do so. Such a description is dangerously close, though Korsch managed to keep his distance, to a purely subjectivist explanation of fetishism, of the kind given by Berger Polberg when, in an article on the sociology of knowledge, the following stupefying definition: alienation is the process by which man forgets that the world he lives in has been produced by himself. What they themselves forget is that if forgetfulness were all that were involved, a reminder should be sufficient to deal with the constituent problem of alienation. You know what? That's a very good point. A lot of people in Marxism, that's kind of what they're just trying to do. They're just trying to give a reminder. But as a result, they end up doing liberal proselytizing, you know. How is it then with Marx? What is in question at the moment are the following forms of manifestation: that labor is represented by the value of its product, labor time by the magnitude of what value, and social relations by the value relation between commodities. For Marx, neither values nor value relations are imaginary. They are not illusory appearances, but realities. This point cannot be emphasized too strongly. It represents a first step towards understanding what is involved in fetishism. Thus, he writes, the labor of the individual asserts itself as part of the labor of society only by means of the relation which the act of exchange establishes directly between the products and indirectly through them, between the producers. To the latter, therefore, the relations connecting the labor of one individual with that of the next appear not as direct social relations between individuals at work, but what they really are: material relations between persons and social relations between things. It is the light of this statement that the ambiguous footnote which occurs shortly afterwards should be interpreted. When therefore Galliani says value is a relation between persons, he ought to have added a relation between persons expressed as a relation between things. This means not that a relation between persons takes on the illusory appearance of a relation between things, but that where commodity production prevails, relations between persons really do take the form of relations between things. This is the specific form of capitalist social relations. Other societies, both pre- and post-capitalist, are characterized by social relations of a different form. A moment's consideration of the defining relations of capitalist society, capitalist over worker, producer of over consumer of commodities, is enough to verify this. For the capitalist, the worker exists only as labor power. For the worker, the capitalist exists only as capital. For the consumer, the producer is commodities, and for the producer, the consumer is money. Althusser is therefore correct to insist that the social relations of production are not reducible to simple relations between men, and the reply of one of his critics that they are, but mediated by things, is not so much as a counterstatement as a restatement of the exact same point. It should, however, be borne in mind that the objects, namely commodities, the value relations between which are the form taken by capitalist social relations, are social and not natural objects. It is just because these value relations are neither imaginary nor illusory but real that Marx is able to make the following judgment. The categories of bourgeois economy are forms of thought expressing with social validity the conditions and relations of a definite historical determined mode of production, viz. The production of commodities. At the same time, Marx describes these forms of thought as absurd. But what kind of absurdity is it? When I state that coats or boots stand in relation to linen because it is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots compare these articles with linen, or what is the same thing, with gold or silver as a universal equivalent, they express the relation between their own private labor as the collective labor society in the same absurd form. It is the absurdity not of an illusion, but of a reality itself, and to this extent it is an absurdity which is true. The social reality behind fetishized relationships. Having insisted on the reality of value and of the objective form taken on by capitalist social relations, the form that is to say of a relation between objects, we further specify them by emphasizing that they are social realities. This determination Marx himself makes quite clear. If we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality, and they acquire this reality only insofar as they're expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance, viz. Human labor, it follows as a matter of course that values can only manifest itself in a social relation of commodity to commodity. The coat, in the expression of value of the linen, represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value. Further, by a third specification, it is necessary to recognize value in the objective form of social realities as historically specific social realities, and not just social realities in general. From this, three important conclusions are to be derived. 1. The distinctions, form over content, essence over appearance, retain their significance for the analysis and explanation of these realities, but on condition that the first term of each composition is not taken to be synonymous with illusion. Because the forms taken by capitalist social relations, their mode of appearance, are historically specific ones, they're puzzling forms. They contain a secret. The reason why social relations should take such forms rather than others are not self-evident. It requires a work of analysis to discover them, to disclose the secret, and in doing so, it reveals the contents of these forms and the essence of these appearances. At the same time, the content explains the form, and by the essence, the appearance, which cease thereafter to be puzzling. But this must not be regarded as a journey from illusion to reality. It is rather a process of elucidating one reality by disclosing its foundation in and determination by another. Thus, the form of value, viz. Exchange, and the object character of social relations is not dissolved or dissipated by Marx as illusions, but its content is laid bare. The individuals working independently and producing use values not for direct consumption but for exchange. It is the commodity form itself which is responsible for the enigma, and its solution therefore requires an analysis of that form. Similarly, Marx uncovers the content of surplus value by indicating its source in the surplus labor time of the worker. He discovers its secret. Bourgeois economy itself, unable to hit upon the secret except in the New World, and even there without drawing the necessary conclusions, takes the form of other road open to it. It dehistoricizes value and surplus value, makes them products of nature, and in parallel fashion regards the impersonal and objective form of capitalist social relations as an entirely natural state of affairs. It thus transforms the properties possessed by commodities, capital, etc. qua social objects, and the qualities belonging naturally to them as things. This is the root and beginning of the mystification of fetishism. 2. It is not that something imaginary has been endowed with the quality of realities. The mechanisms of mystification consist in the collapsing of social facts into natural ones. In this way, the value form is fetishized. This expresses most clearly by Marx in his passage in the second volume, where he refers to the fetishism peculiar to bourgeois political economy, the fetishism which metamorphoses the social-economic character impressed on things in the process of character production into a natural character stemming from the material nature of those things. There is, however, no shortage of examples of Marx observing this metamorphoses in relation to a particular feature of capitalist society. Thus, he writes of the productive power of social labor, cooperation begins only with the labor process, but they, the workers, have been ceased to belong to themselves. Hence, the productive power developed by the laborer when working cooperation is the productive power of capital, because this power consists capital nothing, and because, on the other hand, the laborer himself does not develop it. Therefore, his labor belongs to capital. It appears as a power which capital is endowed by nature. And of money, what appears to happen is not that gold becomes money in consequence of all other commodities expressing their values in it, but on the contrary, that all other commodities universally express their values in gold, because it is money. These objects, gold and silver, just as they come out of the bowels of the earth, are forthwhile the direct incarnation of all human labor, hence the magic of money. And of interest-bearing capital, it becomes a property of money to generate value and yield interest, much as an attribute of pear trees to bear pears. Now, it is in order to undo the mystifying effect of this metamorphosis that Marx insists capital is not a thing, but rather a definite social production relation, belonging to a definite historical formation of society, which is manifested in a thing and lends this thing a specific social character. The demystification is achieved by means of denaturation, but this not the same thing as de-objectification. Pending the destruction of bourgeois society, capital remains an objective form, a social object whose content and essence are accumulated labor, which dominates the agents of society and must be comprehended as such. It should further be noted that this false appearance to which this fetishization of forms give rise are yet something more and else than mere illusions. By this I mean that they're not attributable simply to a failure of perspicacity on the part of the social agents to some act of forgetfulness, with its source in purely subjective deficiencies. In every case, Marx presents us with an example of fetishization. He goes to great pains to indicate the roots and raison d'etre of resulting illusions in the reality itself. Briefly, most, though not all, of his indications can be subsumed under the following general kind of explanation. In capitalist society, the social relations between producers take the form of objective qualities belonging to their products, namely commodities. There is therefore nothing, however, in their commodity which indicates that these qualities, which it actually possesses as commodity, say money, do not belong to it as a thing, gold. The collapse into nature is therefore itself perfectly natural, i.e. comprehensible, if then the social agents experience capitalist society as something other than it really is. This is fundamentally because capitalist society presents itself as something other than it really is. As Maurice Godelier has put it, it is not the subject who deceives himself, but reality which deceives him. 3. We've seen the one type of mystification consists of reducing the social objectivity of the form of capitalist relations to a natural objectivity. This mystification is fetishism. However, Marx also exposes a second type of mystification, one which involves a reduction of these forms, in the opposite direction, from social objectivity to a social subjectivity. This occurs when things are declared to be imaginary fictional forms. Whilst this is not fetishism, indeed, may be regarded as an overreaction against it, it is nevertheless a mystification. The act of exchange gives to the commodity converted into money not its value, but its specific form. By confounding these two distinct things, some writers have led to believe that the value of gold and silver is imaginary, but it be declared that the social character assumed by objects or the material forms assumed by social qualities of labor under the regime of a definite mode of production are mere symbols. It is the same breath also declared that these characteristics are arbitrary fictions sanctioned by the so-called universal content of a mankind. This suitable mode of explanation in favor, during the 18th century, unable to account for the origin of the puzzling forms assumed by social relations between man and man, people sought to denude them of their strange appearance by ascribing them a conventional origin. Thus, the fact that the material forms of capitalist social relations are not natural ones does not deprive them of their objectivity, that is to say, of their character of being objects, which become independent vis-a-vis the social agents dominate them according to their own laws. It cannot be ascribed to human subjectivity either, as their source or as their explanation. Such an ascription, whether it be seen as an agreement, convention, consent, social contract, or as a failure of consciousness, act as forgetting, lack of insight, trick of the imagination, has this theoretical consequence. It spirits away the uncontrollable and fundamentally uncontrollable character of these objects, these forms of capitalist social relations. For in the first case, it is sufficient to undo the agreement, make new agreements, work out new conventions in order to handle the contradictions of capitalism. Marx is plunged into liberal political theory or its poorly disguised variant, social democratic reformism. In the second case, a new act of consciousness, a reappropriation of world and thought, serves the same purpose. Marx is plunged into Hegel. Pure appearance, the wage form. I have dealt so far with those forms of capitalist social relations, those modes of appearance in which they present themselves, which are not illusory as such, but are subject to two kinds of transformation, which render them mystificatory. They are fetishized, i.e. grounded in nature, and given an idealistic explanation. I come now to the forms which are illusory in the full sense, appearances which are mere appearances. First and foremost here, because it is an illusory form, which is in itself the source of a number of other illusions, is the wage form. In this, the value of labor power is transformed in such a way that it takes on the false appearance of the value of labor. It thus distinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor into paid and unpaid labor, which is to say it conceals the essential feature of capitalist relations, namely exploitation. The latter is based on the difference between value and labor power, for which capitalist pays in order to use for a given time, and the greater value which the same labor power in operation creates during that time. But since in the wage form, what appears to happen is the capitalist pays not for the labor power, but for the labor, the inequality of the exchange is falsely disguised as an equal exchange. Those passages where Marx refers to the difference between value and labor power, and the value he creates as a piece of gold, look for the buyer, but by no means an injury to the seller, and where he denies that the seller has been defrauded, must therefore be regarded as having a provisional and double-edged character. On the one hand, it is indeed the case that the capitalist exploitation is not fundamentally based on the individual capitalist cheating his workers. According to all the laws of commodity production, the workers does get paid for the full value of the commodity he sells. On the other hand, these laws themselves entail an injury and a fraud much greater than individual cheating, and the unconscious injury and the defrauding of one class by another. The provisional character of the original statement is therefore made plain. The exchange of equivalents, the original operation with which we started, has now become turned round in such a way that there is only an apparent exchange. The relation of exchange subsisting between capitalist and laborer has become a mere semblance appertaining to the process of circulation, a mere form foreign to the real nature of the transaction and only mystifying it. Here, the analysis of the form, which reveals the content, the penetration of the appearance, which discloses the appearance, is his journey from illusion to reality. The same goes for another of the appearances to which the wage form gives rise, namely, the appearance that the worker disposes of his labor power according to his own free will. This is a mere appearance in illusion whose reality is that the worker is forced to sell his labor power. Thus, the transition from the sphere of circulation, the very Eden of innate birthright of man, where alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, to that of production, which reveals that the time for which he is free to sell his labor power is the time for which he is forced to sell it. The transition is one from illusory reality, in essence, to always remains forced labor, no matter how much it may seem to result from the free contractual agreement. However, two precisions are required to this point. 1. I have said that these analyses, which refer to the appearance, equal exchange, free labor, to the essence, unequal exchange, forced labor, are at the same time journeys from illusion to reality. There also, it is clear, the above transitions from the process of circulation to the process of production. But the circulation process is no illusion. What we are dealing with here are illusions arising in and during the circulation process by contrast with the realities uncovered by an analysis of the production process. This precision is important because it is at all costs necessary to avoid dissolving the various levels of the social totality by regarding them as mere forms of manifestation of one essential level and thus depriving them of their specific efficacy. It is the attempt to theorize this necessity and the concept of overdetermination that is Althusser's real contribution to contemporary Marxist discussion. Nor is it simply a question here of the relation between the circulation and the production process. As Marx makes clear, from these semblances of the sphere of circulation, there arises a whole ideological superstructure, this phenomenal form, i.e. the wage form, which makes the actual relation invisible, and indeed shows the direct opposition to that relation forms the basis of all the juridical notions of both labor and capitalist, of all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, and of all the illusions as to the liberty of all the apological shifts from the vulgar economists. The Marxist critique of illusions pertaining to this superstructure equally does not deprive it of its positive reality. 2. The decisive factor which makes possible the discovery in the production process of the essence of the false appearance of circulation consists in this, that in moving from the circulation to production, the analysis moves from the consideration of relationships between individuals to that of relationships between classes, of which the former are a function. Only this change of terrain can demystify the appearances. Its importance will be dealt with at a later stage of the argument. The wage form, then, unlike the value form, corresponds to no objective reality. Marx is quite unequivocal on this point, and attempts to give it a special emphasis. The value of labor is an expression as imaginary as the value of the earth. Price of labor is just as irrational as a yellow logarithm. That's in volume 3. That's a hard quote. And yet this illusory form is not one that is easily seen through or dissipated. Marx gives notice of this when he describes at one of the three new elements of capital his discovery of the irrationality of the wage form. But he also explicitly in capital, these imaginary expressions arise, however, from the relations of the production themselves. the price of labor power inevitably appears as the price of labor under the capitalist mode of production. If history took a long time to get at the bottom of the mystery of wages, nonetheless, on the other hand, it is more easily to understand that the necessity, the raison d'etre of this phenomena, like this illusions of fetishism discussed above, the illusion of the wage form is opaque and tenacious, because here, as there it is a case of reality deceiving the subject rather than the subject deceiving himself. This is the way the value of labor power presents itself, and Marx analyzes some of the mechanisms of the process, e.g., changes of wages corresponding with the changing of length of the working day, price of labor, does not seem more irrational than the price of cotton, exchange value and use value being intrinsically incommensurable magnitudes anyway. And this, as in the earlier cases, what Marx tells us is that the capitalist society itself is characterized by a quality of opacity, so that it creates the necessity of a methodology which will penetrate the appearance to uncover the reality, and then by reverse course, so to speak, demonstrate why its reality should take on such an appearance. Science and ideology, the Althusserian disjuncture. But all events, this opacity is a historically specific one. For Marx, different types of social relations are characterized by different degrees of opacity and transparency, and capitalism itself creates the historical possibility of a society where the practical relations of everyday life offer to man none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations which regards to his fellow men to nature. A social society would then be one where the social relations are not concealed or distorted by mystificatory ideologies. But here is the notion that the distinction, essence over appearance, is a form of scientificity, as such recurs in the shape of a problem. For if the relation of a socialist society will be transparent, then surely this distinction will be unnecessary to the science of that society, and should be understood, like value and surplus value, as part of that conceptual apparatus necessary to the analysis of capitalism, and not like, say, force and relation of production, as one of the concepts which Marxism brings to the analysis of any social formation. Marx's first specification of the theoretical status of the distinction is then further called into question. In this connection, it is not irrelevant to observe that, inasmuch as the same way as it dehistoricizes the concept of alienation, Althusser obliterates the historical specificity of capitalist opacity and his thesis that, for Marx, even a communist society would not be without its ideology, and its ideology in the Marxist sense, i.e. involving false consciousness. Moreover, it is not the interpretation of Marx that is in question. There are serious theoretical consequences, what becomes, for example, of the notion that the proletariat, taking cognizance of its real situation in capitalist society, in the praxis of abolishing it, of its comprehending the real mechanism of capital exploitation, and revolting against them to create a society in which, among other things, it will be neither exploited nor mystified. What, in short, becomes of the notion of class consciousness? It has vanished literally, without trace. In its place appears the radical disjunction, a new coupure, between the theory and the scientific knowledge of socialist intellectuals and the ideology of the masses. Thus, Althusser speaks of categories appropriate for the ideological struggle, but deficient for the purpose of theory, and of Marxism as a science which produces new forms of ideology in the masses. The unity between the theory of the theoreticians and the practice of the class is broken, and one is left with nothing other than a variant of hostile bourgeois caricature of Leninism. The political leaders use their knowledge to manipulate the consciousness of the masses. Once again, there's a legitimate concern at the bottom of this false position, because that's not what Lenin is really about. Lenin actually agreed with Luxemburg on worker spontaneity. The concern to preserve the specificity of theoretical practice. There is, after all, some distance between the consciousness of even the most revolutionary worker and the science of Marx or Lenin, but it is a distance and not of rupture. Further, it is the distance of dialectical relationship, because traversed in both directions, the scientific theory is brought to bear on the consciousness of the class, and the consciousness of the class also directs and provides orientation for the theory. If this unity is sundered, it becomes difficult to distinguish the Marxist theory of political struggle from a theory of manipulation. Perhaps for this reason, Althusser has more recently permitted himself some more adequate formulations of this relation between theory and class, ones precisely which lay emphasis on the ability of the proletariat to comprehend its objective position and thus liberate it from the postulate eternal subjection of ideology. What is questionable is whether such formulation can be rendered coherent with the theoretical structure he had previously elaborated, or whether, on the other hand, to defend them and give them foundation, he will be forced to abandon his position one after another. The source of Althusser's error is that he read in Capital only a theory of the raison d'etre, of the mystification of a theory which, to be sure, is there, but in reading he failed to perceive what is also there, a theory of the conditions and possibility of demystification. The latter is perhaps less developed than the first, and primarily because Capital terminates abruptly as Marx takes up the consideration of class, vince lins pour le silence. Yet it is plain enough, speaking of the way in which exploitation is concealed by the circulation process, Marx goes on, to be sure, the matter looks quite different if we consider capitalist production in the uninterrupted flow of its renewal, and if, in place of the individual capitalist, the individual worker, we view them in their totality, the capitalist class and the working class confronting each other. But in doing so, we should be applying the standard entirely foreign to the commodity production. The matter looks quite different. The appearance of a relation of equality between individuals gives way to the reality of collective exploitation, and this is achieved by an analysis of the essential relations of capitalist society, i.e. the class relation. But it's not only theoretical analysis which has this effect. The political struggle of the working class is an exact duplication. Here, not the analyst, but the organizing working class applies standards either foreign to commodity production, it ceases to consider the relation of individual capitalist to individual worker, and views them in their totality by actually confronting the capitalist class as a whole. But doing so, it penetrates the false appearance of bourgeois ideology. This in no sense invalidates Marx's proposition that the workers are inevitably mystified so long as, and to the extent that they remain trapped within bourgeois relations of production. For this is so, but the proletariat does not escape these relations of production only on day of the socialist revolution. It begins to consider them from the moment it engages in organized political struggle. Since the latter involves the adoption of a class position, this criterion entirely foreign to the commodity production and the refusal any longer to think exclusively in terms of relation between individuals. For this reason, the, quote, structuralist notion of the revolution as rupture, Althusser, or limit, Godelier, are less precise than the notion of revolution as praxis, which, to be sure, is its ruptural point. So, to be clear, I say, and a lot of people say, revolution, it's not a gradual process, it's a moment of rupture. Okay, that's not wrong, that's not inherently structural, okay? It's the ruptural point within praxis is precisely what that means. And the full force of Rosa Luxemburg's insistence on the demystifying effects of mass political struggle becomes evident. At the same time, the Althusserian disjunction between the consciousness of the masses and that of the theoretician is shown to lack foundation. The integral relation between the two is based on the fact that the theoretician takes up in analysis the same positions as the masses adopt in political struggle, though of course this should not be understood as a reduction of the sort theory as practice. The above passage from Marx also introduces another dilemma of the distinction, essence over appearance, one which has been emphasized above all by Herbert Marcuse in Reason and Revolution. As we have seen, all the concepts with which Marx specifies the essential relations of capitalist society have basically a cognitive function. They make it possible a knowledge of reality in opposition to the false evidences of immediate appearance. But if in order to do this, and in the process of doing it, they refer us to the standards entirely foreign to commodity production, then they're at the same time critical concepts. Thus, the concept of surplus value not only permits a comprehension of the mechanism of capitalist exploitation by laying bare the division of the working day into necessary and surplus labor time, it envisages a state of affairs in which there is no exploitation. It contains an accusation and an imperative. However, this critical function of the concepts must not be understood as a mere taking up of positions or moralizing. If they fail in their cognitive function, then they're useless in their critical one. When Marx clearly takes his distance from the kind of criticism which knows how to judge and condemns the present but not how to comprehend it, he informs us that the essential concept derive what validity they have not from the particular moral stance, relativism, but from the fact that they permit a coherent organization of appearance and an explanation of their sources such as no other concepts can provide. This is indeed the criterion which validates these concepts. As Marcuse has expressed it, if the historical structure postulated as essential for explanation makes it possible to comprehend causally the situation both in its individual phase as well as in terms of its tendencies effective within it, then it is really the essential in that manifold of appearance. This determination of essence is true. It is held good within the theory. It remains to make explicit that in capital, the distinction between essence and appearance is as well everything else, a distinction also between the totality and the parts. Each single relationship or fact is an appearance whose full meaning is or reality is only articulated by the integrating its theoretical within its total structure. This has already been seen with regards to the light thrown on individual relations by consideration of relations between classes, but it applies more generally. I confine myself to certain pairs of facts treated by Marx in his chapter on machinery and modern industry. Machinery is the most powerful instrument for lightening labor. Its capitalist employment leads to greater exploitation and domination. Science and technology make huge and unprecedented strikes under capitalism, but at the expense of the workers' physical and intellectual powers. Modern machinery shatters the petrified form of the division of labor, creating the need for variability of function and thus for less one-sidedness, more round development of the worker under the anarchic conditions of capitalism. However, the worker lives and experiences this tendency as insecurity of employment and suffering. These pairs of facts are actually contradictions. As such, they represent tendencies which are neither simply progressive nor simply regressive, because contradictory, the essence which explains them and deprives them of all appearances of contingency, is that the central contradiction between forces of production, the increasing productive power of social labor on one hand in relation to production, the continuing private appropriation of surplus value on the other. They partake in the central contradiction, and as partial facts, it's only properly comprehended in relation into the social totality with which they in it inhabit. Since that was a bit dense, let me try and lay everything out, at least how I understood it and my main takeaways. Capitalist society is structured such that social relations exist in the form of things. This form both expresses and conceals those relations, and therefore mystification is real, objective, and necessary. It is not the subject who deceives himself, but reality which deceives the subject. Appearance is not something simply false, but a form of reality. In capitalism, social relations really do take the form of things: commodities, money, capital. Fetishism is the real social appearance caused by the structure of society itself being inverted. Reality is being presented in a misleading manner, in a way that is not arbitrarily decided or coincidental at all, but caused by the social forces within society permeating in a certain manner. That's what class conflict is. Marx does not posit a noumenal or phenomenal world a la Kant. That's a very easy misconception that, there's price on the market and that's the phenomena, and the noumena is the labor that went into it. No, that's not at all it. The value form is the congealed, it's the appearance of the essence that is class struggle. And that's why a social society cannot have the value form. Or, well, it can, but only in distribution. Okay, I'll just read my other audiobook on that. But I mean, it's part. It's. I mean, that's the thing is. I mean, that's part of class conflict. It's just the class conflict is apparent. There, it's part of the system. It's not concealed. Value exists only in its appearance in the realm of exchange relations. Marx did not peel away in quotes appearance to find value underneath. He explained why value necessarily appears in the way it does. Mystification is the real social relations taking a form that conceals their own basis. The social appears as natural, and human relations appear as property.